So in the last lesson we had a look at adding and subtracting fractions which had the same denominators, and we saw that the simple rule of all you need to do is add the numerators as long as the denominators are the same. So for example, 1/3 plus another 1/3, the answer to that is 2/3. What we're going on to look at today is what happens if you're trying to do something like 1/3 plus a fifth, or something along those lines. So in order to be able to do this, what we'll be using, we will use our knowledge of times tables. We will be finding lowest common multiple of the denominators and going on to find the equivalent fractions. Once we've got those fractions in the same denominators, we'll then be able to go on and add or subtract. So let's have a wee look and a little think. For example, how could we add a half plus a quarter? If you think about a clock face when you're doing this, so for a half, right, that would be your half an hour. If you then add on a quarter of the clock face, that would take you round to there. So hopefully you can see that by doing that, so adding a half plus a quarter, right, would be that amount of time there, and we would actually say, well, that's equal to 3/4. So how do we get from that half plus a quarter? We saw yesterday that if you were doing 1/5 plus 2/5, for example, that the answer is not 3/10. You add the 1 and the 2, you do not add the bottom numbers. So it's all about the fifths, and we would see the answer was 3/5. But how do we get from a half plus a quarter to 3/4? So what do we need to do? So on the next page, you'll see I'm going to take you through the steps that I need you to do. So what happens is, if we've got fractions with different denominators, then we need to first of all find the lowest common multiple of those denominators, and then we will find equivalent fractions using that denominator. And when you've changed your denominator and your fraction, remember that your numerator needs to also change at the same rate. So if we think about the one we were just discussing, how do we get from a half plus a quarter to that answer? If we know the answer is 3/4, how can we get there? Well, if we wrote down that the lowest common multiple of 2 and 4 is equal to, now this is where I need you to think about your times tables. If we wrote down what's the 4 times table, so 4 times table, 4, 8, 12, and so on. The 2 times table, right, your 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, and so on. And what you should see is that without, I mean, you don't even need to write this down, hopefully you can see this in your head, that 4 is the first number that's in both the 2 and the 4 times table. So lowest common multiple of 2 and 4 is 4. So that means that I don't need to change, the quarter is fine as it is, but I need to be able to write the half in terms of quarters. So I'm basically going to be changing from my half here, and the process that I'm doing in order to do that is I am multiplying by 2. Now this is the last step said about if you change the bottom of your fraction, remember that you also need to change the top. So both these numbers need to get multiplied by 2. So a half is the same thing as 2/4. Once we're at that point, we can then see, well, actually now my denominators are the same. All I need to be able to do is add the top numbers, and there's how we get the 3/4. So let's look at the steps again, and then we'll come back and look at that example. So how do we add fractions with different denominators? Well, you look at the denominators, you find the lowest common multiple. That's the first number that's in both times tables of the two denominators. You then use that number to get your equivalent fractions with that denominator, but remember, when you change your denominator in your fraction, you've also got to change the numerator by the same rate. So that's why here we were multiplying by 2. That got us the top of that fraction. So let's look at another couple of examples. And again, if you can pause these or copy them down after, go back and watch it. If we said for this one, we're looking at lowest common multiple of 5 and 10. So what's the first number that's in the 5 and also in the 10 times table? Hopefully, without writing it out, you know it's going to be 10. So that would tell me I wouldn't be changing the second fraction, just remains as it is, but I need to make that first fraction have a bottom number of 10. Now, my first fraction is 3/5. To change it into tenths, right, I am multiplying, right, that bottom number is getting multiplied by 2. That means that I also need to multiply the top number by 2. So that would tell me that what goes on the top of my fraction is going to be 6. So we're replacing 3/5 with 6/10. Now that I've done that, I'm then ready to carry out the calculation. We've got tenths on the bottom, so all I'm going to do is take the numbers away on the top. That gives me 5/10. And of course, with all fraction work, you should know that you should be making your fraction as simple as possible for your final answer. So in this particular instance, you would be looking to have your final answer would be 1/2. So if you haven't copied that, suggest you can copy it at the end or go back and look at the notes, will help you as well. So lowest common multiple for this one, we've got two fractions that are 1/4 and 5ths. So our bottom of our fraction needs to be the lowest common multiple 4 and 5, which would be 20. So I need to be changing both of these fractions into 20 on the bottom. So thinking about what am I doing? So how am I changing from each of these? So the 4, to change it into 20, you are timesing by 5. But that means I also need to times that top number by 5 as well. So what I end up with here would be 15. On this side, I'm changing from the 5 into 20 by timesing by 4. So I will also need to times that top number by 4 so that you get 8 here. Once you've done that, you can then see your two fractions have got the same bottom number, and you are just adding what's on the top. So your 15 and your 8, add those together, you would get 23/20. That's an improper fraction. If you divide 20 into 23, goes in ones with 3 left over. So you would write 1 whole and 3/20. And that would be it. So that's how we add or subtract fractions with different denominators. You are looking to change, right? The two fractions need to have the same denominator before they can be added or subtracted, and you change them into equivalent fractions in order to do that. So just to go through the process again, you find the lowest common multiple of the denominators, you make your equivalent fractions with that denominator, and remember that if you change the denominator, you also need to change the numerator. And once you've got the fractions like that, so once the denominators are the same, you are then just adding or subtracting the top number. Now it's your turn to have a go.